There's a specific kind of person who declines invitations, requests, and offers with just the word no, and they're not rude, cold, or inconsiderate of others' feelings. The psychology behind this, what actually happens in their brain when they refuse to justify their boundaries, reveals why some people over explain everything while others don't. And if you're watching this, there's a reason you're here. See, here's what's wild about saying no without explanation. We've spent decades studying people pleasing, boundary setting, and social psychology, but only recently have researchers started asking a different question about refusal patterns. What about people who can decline without guilt, defensiveness, or the compulsive need to justify their choices to maintain social approval? There's actual psychology behind this, and it's not what you think. First, let's get real about what saying no without explaining actually does to certain brains, because this isn't just being blunt or socially unaware. When someone who says no without explaining is pressured to provide justification, their brain experiences what psychologists call boundary preservation, protecting autonomy from external invasion. Studies show that for certain personality types, offering explanations for every no creates psychological vulnerability where others can argue, manipulate, or guilt them into compliance. Your brain recognizes that justifications aren't actually required for personal decisions. They're social performances designed to protect the other person's feelings at your expense. The effects are measurable: stronger boundaries, lower people-pleasing tendencies, reduced guilt after declining, and what researchers call self-determined functioning operating from internal values. And here's the key part that changes everything about how we understand boundary psychology. These aren't people who lack empathy or don't care about others' feelings. They're protecting their right to autonomous decision-making from social pressure that erodes it. They've discovered through experience that over-explaining creates opportunities for negotiation, debate, and manipulation that wouldn't exist if the no stood alone. Research on boundary psychology found that people fall on a spectrum between external validators who need others' approval for decisions and internal validators who trust their own judgment. People who say no without explaining cluster heavily on the internal validation end, and their brains are optimized for self-trust rather than social approval. But here's where it gets interesting, because what happens when these people are pressured to explain reveals the entire psychology behind this behavior. Here's what researchers discovered that explains everything. When you justify a no, your brain signals that the decision is negotiable, open for debate, or requires permission. And this fundamentally changes the power dynamic because offering reasons creates openings where others can challenge your logic, offer solutions, or make you feel guilty. This isn't about being difficult or refusing to communicate. It's about recognizing that no is a complete sentence when it comes to personal boundaries. When you have strong internal locus of control, your brain understands that you're the authority on your own time, energy, and choices, not other people. But when you over-explain every no, you're subconsciously asking for permission, validating that others have a say in decisions that are fundamentally yours alone. Studies on assertiveness show that people who say no without explaining experience significantly less guilt, anxiety, and post-decision rumination than chronic over-explainers. Their boundaries remain clear, consistent, and respected because there's nothing to argue with, no excuses to poke holes in, no justifications to negotiate around. Here's the paradox that might validate your instinct to keep it simple when declining. The people with the strongest, most respected boundaries often use the fewest words to maintain them, understanding that brevity communicates confidence and finality. They understood intuitively what research now confirms, that every additional word after no is an invitation for the other person to challenge, persuade, or guilt you. If you're someone who needs to explain every decision, justification feels like kindness, like you're being considerate by helping others understand your reasoning. But for internal validators, over-explaining feels like weakness, like you're allowing others to judge whether your reasons are good enough to permit your own choices. And if that's you, Saying no without explaining isn't being cold. It's exercising your fundamental right to self-determination without requiring external approval. But wait, before you think this means you should never provide context or communicate with people, let me stop you right there. Understanding this psychology doesn't mean being needlessly cryptic or refusing all communication in relationships. Let me be clear about the distinction. Explaining because you want to versus explaining because you feel obligated are completely different. You can offer context when it serves connection without making it a requirement. The research identifies 5 psychological traits that consistently show up in people who say no without explaining their decisions. 1. Strong internal locus of control. They genuinely believe they're the authority on their own life, not requiring external validation for personal choices. 2. Low people-pleasing tendencies. They're comfortable disappointing others when necessary and don't derive self-worth from constant approval or being liked by everyone. 3. Clear understanding of boundaries. They recognize that personal decisions don't require justification, defense, or permission from others to be valid and worthy of respect. 4. Immunity to guilt manipulation. They've learned to distinguish between healthy guilt from actual wrongdoing and manufactured guilt from boundary violations being called selfish. 5. Respect for their own time and energy. They understand that lengthy explanations are emotional labor. They're not obligated to perform for every person who feels entitled to reasons. But here's the part that reveals deeper psychology and prevents us from oversimplifying this into just being assertive or having good boundaries. Not everyone who says no without explaining does so from the same psychological foundation, and that distinction matters enormously for understanding your own patterns. Some people say no without explaining because they're conflict avoidant, passive aggressive, or using silence as punishment rather than healthy boundary setting. That's withholding driven by dysfunction. Others do it because their brain genuinely understands that explanations aren't required for autonomous decisions, and justifying everything creates psychological vulnerability. That's brevity driven by wisdom. If you're saying no without explaining because you're angry or trying to punish people, that's worth examining because unhealthy communication patterns damage relationships. If you're doing it because you've learned that over-explaining invites manipulation and you're protecting your boundaries, that's worth honoring as psychological maturity. Here's what I need you to understand about people who say no without explaining. They're not rude, cold, or lacking in social skills. They're protecting their autonomy from a culture that demands justification for every personal choice, as if our own preferences require external validation to be legitimate. Studies show that people who say no without excessive explanation report higher self-esteem, stronger boundaries, and better mental health than chronic over-explainers and people-pleasers. They've discovered that the discomfort others feel when you don't justify yourself is their responsibility to manage, not yours to prevent through endless explanations. This is boundary literacy, not rudeness. But here's the practical reality that makes saying no without explaining socially complicated. Society expects justification for every no, treating unexplained refusals as rude, suspicious, or evidence that you don't care about the relationship or person asking. So saying no without explaining often means being labeled difficult, cold, or selfish by people who feel entitled to control your decisions through guilt and social pressure. The solution isn't over-explaining to manage everyone's feelings. It's understanding that healthy relationships respect no without requiring you to defend your right to say it. Research on relationships shows that people who respect boundaries without demanding justification are actually safer, healthier connections than those who treat no as negotiable. The ones who push for explanations, who argue with your reasons, who make you feel guilty for declining, those are the relationships where unexplained no's matter most. Here's what gets me about this research on boundary psychology. It validates something our culture pathologizes: the right to autonomous decision-making without constant justification. We've built a society that treats personal choices as requiring permission, where saying no without a good enough reason is considered selfish rather than self respecting. If you're someone who says no without explaining and you're still here navigating relationships with people who demand justification, that's not being difficult. That's you honoring the fundamental truth that you're the authority on your own life, and that no is a complete sentence when it comes to your boundaries. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support more deep dives into how human psychology actually works.